Hey, welcome to Real Estate Resource. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. I really hope you enjoy this video. So we're going to continue where we left off last week, going through the RPA. We're going line by line, point by point. We're talking about all of the issues that can pop up, making sure we're filling out things properly to help avoid those issues that may pop up. The more precise and clear and points that I cover in a purchase agreement from the very beginning, whether I be the buyer's agent or the listing agent, that I'm the one who's cleaning it up and making sure everything is complete. The more I do that at the beginning, the less issues I have down the road. So my whole approach to looking at the RPA from a listing agent's perspective, because I've told you guys before, as a listing agent, you've got to have a much better grasp of this contract than a buyer's agent has, right? Because the purchase agreement itself is inherently built to protect the interests of the buyer's agent or of the buyer. So a buyer's agent really kind of only has to fill in the blanks, and offers can be valid with things missing. So as listing agent, it's my job to comb through it and make sure that there aren't things that are left out, that there all of the issues that I could potentially see coming down the 30, 45-day escrow, that we're addressing them from the beginning. So that's our job as listing agent, is to make sure, right? We have to be the ones that kind of clean up and make sure that we're protecting our sellers, only because the inherent protections are already built in for the buyer. So we've got to add those protections in for the seller. Okay. So that's the reason why I spend so much time on this RPA, is that number one is, you guys, as most agents, you start as a buyer's agent, right? That's where agents start, and you convert into a listing agent. So you've got to be able to protect yourself as best as possible and protect your clients. But that knowledge of the contract and how you're going to handle transactions when you get them is going to make you a better listing agent. And so hopefully everything that we're leaning toward is getting you to the point where you're more confident in your skills and you're becoming a better listing agent, because there is nothing that is going to keep you in this business longer than taking listings. If you're a listing agent, you'll have a long career. Buyer's agent is a lot more taxing, and it's harder to stay in this business for a long time when you're focused only on buyers. All right. So with that said, looks like everybody's in. Let me share my screen. All right. There we go. That's there. If you guys have any questions, you could throw them in the chat or raise your hand. It's easier than just unmuting, and then I'll get to you guys. All right. So we left off last week at the expiration of the offer. That's what we were talking about, because people really don't address it. And honestly, most offers do not get presented within 3 days of their submission, right? Within 3 days of the signature, 3 days of the preparation of that offer. So remember, as a listing agent, I have to make sure that the expiration date is going to outlast my presentation date. And if I'm a buyer's agent, part of my job when I'm having a conversation with the listing agent about submitting the offer, other than just what are the best terms, is when are you going to present? Because I want to make sure from the beginning that I am the one who is extending the offer through that presentation period. So please don't ignore that. Make sure that you have that conversation with the listing agent, and that you have ample time in there for the expiration, so it doesn't expire prior to your offer being presented. Initial deposit, right? So this is our EMD, the earnest money deposit. This is us. This is our commitment. This is our first chance to show strength of offer, right? And we talk about this a lot in the classes that we do on writing offers. And if you're working with a buyer, my job as a buyer's agent is to make sure that I'm presenting the strongest offer possible, putting my best foot forward for that buyer. And your initial deposit is the first place to show that, right? If we start looking at the amount, the purchase price of the properties that we work with, you're at a minimum, you're probably talking about in the 500s, right? And I still see offers with $1,000 and $2,000 initial deposits. That initial deposit amount is key to helping you have a strong enough offer to at least get a counter or to get it accepted. In the amount of the sales price that we're working in on a regular basis, and this for those of you guys watching these videos later, that sales price could be different for you, right? But still, the amount of money that we're spending, that the purchase prices that we're seeing, the amount of money, those are high enough that those small deposits, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, even 5,000 at this point, are negligible. We have to show that we have a strong offer, and there's still competition because inventory is so low. Competition is still high. So my suggestion is that you should not submit an offer in our marketplace with less than a $10,000 deposit. Less, because everybody's putting money in now. I know there are some down payment assistance programs and things like that where maybe your buyer doesn't have that amount of money, but if they don't have 10,000 because they're getting down payment assistance and they're not paying their closing costs, then whatever money they have to put in, right, the max amount of money they can put, the max, right? Because if I have $100,000 in my bank account and I put $10,000 down because that's what I want to put down and I'm showing my proof of funds, maybe somebody who only has $8,000 and is putting $8,000 as the initial deposit, I know it becomes scary for the buyer, but that deposit is protected. We've talked about it a number of times. Maybe that's showing that I'm putting everything I have into this can help improve their position just because of the commitment to the offer. I hope that makes sense. Jenny, yeah, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Kyle, actually, my question is a little backtracked for the expiration.
Okay.
What do you recommend we do in the instance where either the MLS or the listing agent has mentioned that they're not planning to present offers until later, but how do we protect our offer in the case where maybe they do receive offers and the seller changes their mind and decides that, yes, they'll present it before? If we wait, so our offer doesn't expire, we might risk not having our offer presented. So what do you recommend in that case?
Well, I mean, you should never wait to submit your offer, number one. If somebody tells you, if a listing agent tells you, oh, I'm not presenting until next week, don't wait till next week to submit your offer. That's crazy. Submit your offer. Just make sure your expiration date, when you see this date right here, extends past next week.
Oh, gotcha.
So your offer is presented. You're not sitting and waiting for like, okay, well, we can submit our offer tomorrow because they're presenting on Friday, right? No. Submit your offer. Just make sure expiration date extends past that offer presentation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Deposit. So put the amount of deposit in as strong as you can go. When you start getting into, 900,000, 850,000, 900,000, a million, over a million, you're probably going to have to put in deposits that are 3% of the purchase price. That's going to be one of the requirements of the listing agent for you to submit your offer, right? That's just going to happen. So make sure that your deposit makes sense based on your offer. Now, this little percentage over here, it's just to show the calculation. So for example, if I was putting a $1 million offer and I put a $10,000 deposit, well, then it would be 1% of the purchase price. But that doesn't mean that my deposit is always 1%, right? For example, if I submit that 1 million and it's a $10,000 deposit, and then they counter me back to 1.2, it doesn't go up to a $12,000 deposit unless they counter the deposit. So you guys have to understand that just because that percentage is there, it doesn't change the total amount of deposit based on that percentage. So if I have a $10,000 deposit and they increase my purchase price by $50,000 or $100,000, my deposit is still $10,000 unless the counter says something different. Okay. The reason I brought that up is because somebody asked me that today, that they were under the impression that your initial deposit was affected by your purchase price, and it is not unless it's addressed in a counteroffer. So you guys have to understand that. Okay. So just to clarify. So by default, your deposit has to be in escrow within 3 business days Or you could change it. You could say 1 business day, 2, 5, whatever you want to change it to, you can change it. Within 3 business days after acceptance by a wire transfer. That's the default now, is by wire transfer, right? There's no choice for check. There's no choice for anything else. It is wire transfer. It is cleaner. It is better for you as an agent. There's less liability, less steps for you in handling the transaction than to let them put it in by wire transfer. Now, business days. This is the only reference to business days in the purchase agreement. All other time periods are calendar days, okay? But business days, because obviously escrows aren't open on Saturdays and Sundays to accept deposits, so you have to allow for business days. What that means for business days, and you guys have to understand how it counts. Today, if our offer is accepted today, today is day 0, right? The acceptance date is day 0. Tomorrow, Friday, would be day 1, okay? Because this is business days, day 2 would be Tuesday, and day 3 would be next Wednesday, okay? So remember, it's business days, 3 business days. If I accept the offer today, my deposit would have to be wired into escrow no later than next Wednesday, okay? So that's how that works. Questions about deposit? Questions about deposit? You guys got it all down. You're good. Perfect. All right, terrific. The next one, increased deposit. And I like that they added this little piece. It didn't used to be there in the contract, but they added this so people know what it is. This is money placed into escrow after the initial deposit. Okay. There's a form called the DID for the increased deposit. And what that DID form does is it's called the deposit for increase, or it's called shoot, I'd have to look at that. My mind went blank right now for the name of it. But what it is it's basically a receipt for the increased deposited funds to add them into liquidated damages along with the initial deposit money. Okay. So we'll talk about liquidated damages obviously much later in the contract. But what happens is liquidated damages are directly affect what happens with this deposit. And if I put $10,000 in as my initial deposit, and that's all the money I put in, that's all the money that's at jeopardy, right, for liquidated damages if I breach the contract. If I have to do an increased deposit for whatever reason, I want to make sure we're checking this box and we're including in this form DID because I want that to be part of the liquidated damages. So let's talk about how this would work. Your buyer, okay, is getting all of their funds from a 401k. Okay, so in order for them to borrow from a 401k, what has to happen? Who wants to answer? What has to happen before I can borrow the funds from a 401k? Anybody?
Don't we have to have an accepted offer?
There you go. Accepted offer, right? I have to have an accepted offer. So if all the money that I'm using to purchase the property is tied up in my 401k, I can't even get stuff to add to my deposit because I have to have an accepted offer. So let's say I have $4,000 in my bank account that I can have access to, that I can use for initial deposit, but I want to put a 10,000 or I want to put a bigger one because it's a high purchase price. Then I would check increased deposit. I would put the amount that I'm going to put in. I would put when I would put it in, right? The default is when I remove all my contingencies, it's going in. As a listing agent, I'm not accepting that. If you're going to put initial deposit money in, you're putting it in. If it's going to be part of that liquidated damages, you're putting it at the beginning or as soon as possible. So it usually takes about 10 days or so after you get an accepted offer. So you got to take some time. So maybe put a couple weeks in there, whatever, and figure out a date that you're going to put that initial deposit, the additional deposit money in. So that way I can have an accepted offer, submit that to my 401k, get all the funds I need, and then add the amount of money that I'm going to put in. That's when you would use an increased deposit. That's really the only reason. There's no other reason really to use it other than I don't have access to the money right now, but I will, and I want to have a bigger deposit. That's it. Any questions about increased deposit? No? Okay. All right. So we're moving on to loan amount. This is your first trust deed, right? Your mortgage. That's what this is. This is the first. Now, I know that we don't really deal with first and second at this in this market, or haven't for quite a while, but they did exist at one time. But this is your first. This is the loan that takes precedent over everything else. This is the amount of the loan. Okay. Now, if it's FHA and you're doing a 3.5% down payment, this amount that's going to go here is going to be 96.5% of my initial offer price. So whatever the offer price is here, this will be 96.5% of that if it is a basic FHA loan. Okay. And it'll calculate that here, but you can't put the percentage in and then have it calculate for you. It doesn't work like that. So I put the amount in here. And then if it's conventional, I don't have to do anything. If it's FHA, I have to check this. If it's VA, I have to check that. Okay. If there's seller financing that we're asking for, I check that box, and there's a seller financing addendum that goes in. It's fine. Now, this default is a fixed rate. If you have an adjustable rate, you would just have to check this box that it's adjustable rate. And then we get to this point, not to exceed blank percent. Okay. You have to put a number in this spot, nothing else. It cannot be blank. It cannot be letters. It is a number. That is a percentage. That's what it's asking for. So what you have to do is you have to find out from the lender what interest rate your buyer is obtaining, and then add about 0.25% to it, because you don't want to exceed the rate during your escrow period, right? Rates fluctuate. You don't want, for whatever reason, the price to go, the amount to go up and exceed this percentage, because this is binding to the contract. Okay, so to repeat that, it's binding. This is not just an estimate. It's not a throwaway. It's not just there because we have to. It is binding, which means if I state an interest rate in that section, and when I get approval from the lender, it exceeds that interest rate, I am not obligated to continue with the purchase, whether I've removed my contingencies or not, which means that I could be towards the end, have removed all my contingencies, my rate for whatever reason exceeds that, I could cancel. And with a blank, there's an argument that could be made that I could do the same thing. Well, I didn't agree to a maximum interest rate and I don't like this one. And that would be my argument to be able to cancel. So for me as listing agent, if I get an offer that has nothing in there, or has best prevailing rate in there, or has a too low of an interest rate based on what's happening, right, with the rates right now, I am going to counter it. And I am going to dictate the rate that they're going to accept, the maximum rate. Now, that way I'm in control. I'm saying, listen, I know that rates right now are, let's say they're 6.25. You're going to agree to a 6.5 maximum interest rate. That's it. If it exceeds 6.5, I screw up and you're out. You get to leave. I get it. But I'm going to put something in there. And the reason I'm going to do it is I have in the counters that I've given you guys in the past, that you counter them to, prior to acceptance, prior to disclose maximum interest rate for buyer on first trust deed. I don't trust buyer's agents. I mean, number one, I see a lot of your guys' offers. And then number two, I see the offers that come in. And I see the counters from listing agents that are quite frankly terrible too. And so I think that if I'm going to be in control of it, I'm going to be in control of it. I'm going to make sure that we're asking for a reasonable interest rate that could keep them locked in to complete the purchase. Same thing goes for you as a buyer's agent. You have to be able to explain to your buyer, the reason we're putting this interest rate with this 0.25% bump in it is because rates are volatile, right? They fluctuate often. And we want to make sure that we're committed, that we're showing our commitment to close this escrow, even if it were to go up 0.25 point. But if it exceeds that 0.25 point, you'll be able to get out of the transaction. As long as it stays below this interest rate that we're in there, then you're committed to purchase. Okay. And it doesn't mean you have to pay that interest rate. All it means is this is going to be the maximum interest rate, the rate that we're not going to exceed. We'll pay anything under it, but nothing over it. Okay, so you guys have to understand how that works as a buyer's agent when you're having the conversation with the buyers, because they're gonna get the idea like, well, if I put 6.5, then I'm gonna have to pay 6.5. That's not the case. That's not how it works. Joseph, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Because it's just happened to me. What if the buyers are gonna get the rate lock as soon as they get the contract accepted?
Okay, rate locks don't last forever. You gotta
Oh,
mute
okay.
because you're echoing.
Oh,
Rate locks don't last forever. And so what happens if we have to extend the escrow past the rate lock? What if the interest rate goes up? I mean, there's stuff that happens, but it doesn't matter. Regardless, the idea for this is I'm showing commitment to the seller. Remember, when I'm writing an offer, I'm trying to write an offer that's as strong as possible because I need to get mine to stand out against the other 4 or 5 offers that may be coming on the property, because inventory is so low, there's going to be competition. There's going to be competition, plain and simple. So that's what that's for. It doesn't matter if you pay to lock the rate. It doesn't matter for those rate locks don't last forever. And it's me showing that I have a commitment to my purchase. Okay. Anybody else? Questions? Okay. Buyer to pay up to blank points to obtain the rate above. Now, let's say that they're buying down a rate, right? It's a low rate. The buyer is going to pay these points to buy that rate down. That's what those points are for. Okay. They obtain the rate that's above. If they don't have to pay any points to get the going rate, right? Let's say the going rate is 6.5. We write our offer at 6.75. It doesn't cost me any points to get to that interest rate. I don't put anything in there. Those points are only there if I'm getting an artificially lower rate, right? Like I'm buying down the rate by 1/4 of a point or 1/2 a point or whatever it is the costs are. That's what that's for. And that's it. Okay. These forms right here for FHA, they have to be attached to your offer. And generally, if you check these boxes, they will be, right? The FVAC and the HID for FHA. FVAC is the FHA and VA amendatory clause. And what that states is, if the property does not appraise for the amount that is written into the FVAC, then regardless of contingency removals, the buyer's deposit is still protected. Okay, so you have to keep that part in mind, and we'll talk about it a little bit when we get to appraisals, but that's what the FVAC is. The HID is for the home inspection disclosures. VA doesn't require that, only the FVAC. Okay, this is for the lender required repairs. It matches up with your inspection of the property and any other repairs that you're going to request. There used to be a separate form for FHA and VA lender required repairs. That doesn't exist anymore. It is now on the request for repairs. If you have to ask for repairs based on the lender, they are on the regular request for repairs now. Kenya, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, so I just want to go back to the rate and the buyer pay up to points. Just want to make sure. So the buyer to pay up to points, I don't need to put anything in there, just if they buying like the
only if they're buying the rate down. Only if they're buying the rate down. Unless, like, you know, because there's programs out there that like, hey, if you pay X amount of points, this is the rate. But for most buyers, they're not paying any points and they're getting whatever the going rate is. But if they're paying points to get the rate that we're stating, then you have to disclose those points that they're paying.
And the other one, we have to put something in there with the interest.
If they're paying points to obtain that rate, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. All right. So 17 days after acceptance, any lender required repairs are also going to be addressed on your regular request for repairs, which means that you guys have got to get on the ball to get the appraisal ordered right away, because that's where the lender required repairs are going to come up. So you've got to have your inspection and your appraisal done before you send any requests for repairs if you're an FHA or VA loan. Okay. All right. Additional financing. This is for second loans, things that you're actually making a payment on, and it's the same way. How much is the loan? What's the fixed or initial rate? What's the rate not to exceed? And are you paying any points? That's it for the second. Okay. There isn't really any secondary financing anymore. It used to be, that was our go-to. I know we sound like old people when we talk about, well, in 2006 and 5 in the last market, like Yes, there used to be first and seconds, and people were doing 103% financing. That doesn't exist anymore. So you're probably not going to run into that anytime soon, but that's what that is. You have to disclose the terms of that second mortgage the same way you did with the first. Okay. Here, the occupancy type for the offer for this property, is it going to be our primary residence? Is it going to be secondary residence, which means like a vacation home, something like that, or an investment property? We have to check off those boxes. You need to check off the box. Why would some buyers or buyers agents not check off those boxes for secondary and investment properties? Why wouldn't they? Who wants to take a guess? No, it's because the rates are going to be higher on those.
Yeah.
Right? The rates are going to be higher on those because it's not their principal residence, not their primary residence. So sometimes the agents will submit offers with not checking any boxes, leaving that primary default there in order to get a higher or to get the lower rate. Okay. But if you know that they're not going to live in the property, that this is a second home or an investment property, it's your job to make sure that those things are checked off properly, because technically that is loan fraud and you guys shouldn't be participating in it. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Balance of down payment. This is your down payment amount minus whatever is here or here, right? So if I put a $10,000 deposit here and my down payment was going to be $100,000, then right here is going to be $90,000. That's what's going to go there because I have a $10,000 deposit, $90,000 here, and then this purchase price should match this purchase price up here. That's it. That's very straightforward with the math. Okay. Buyer's initial, and you're ready to go. Questions about page 1 before I move on to page 2? Yeah, Darwin, go ahead.
Buzz, I had a question. I submit offers with 20% down. I just did yesterday. And let's say that my buyer is going to come out with 25% down. Usually I don't see a problem with escrows because they increase it. Why? My question is why, when you want to come out with less than 20% down, escrow want to make it like a big deal? That's my question.
Okay, so let me see if I get this straight. So I submit an offer with 20% down, and then halfway through, my lender says, "Hey, you know, if you could put an extra 5%, you get a better rate." So I put extra 5% down. Now I'm 25% down, or vice versa. I go in at 20% down, and my lender says, "Hey, you know what? If we do 10 instead of 20, I can move you over to this program. You can get this better rate." So I yell, "Yeah, we want to reduce it to 10." Is that what you're saying? That escrow has an issue with the reduction in the down payment?
Yes, that's exactly a deal that I just closed a month ago.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
I see the
reason. Yeah. Well, I'll stop. It doesn't. I mean, number one, everyone should have a problem with it. Listing agent, seller, escrow, not just escrow. You're changing financing without getting the approval of the seller. You can't do that. You're not even supposed to increase your deposit without the approval of the seller. I'm assuming that escrow doesn't do it because the escrow doesn't give you a hard time about it because they're assuming that it still makes your offer stronger as opposed to weaker with a lower down payment. But if I change anything about my financing, and there's a paragraph, and we'll talk about this much later in the contract, but if I change anything, the initial deposit, the increased deposit, the loan, I change anything about this term, I have to get written approval from the seller before I can do it. If I don't do that, the seller does not have to go along with my change. And if I don't qualify, once I make that change, they don't have to honor the loan contingency, which means you lose your deposit. So escrow's right in giving you a hard time about reducing your down payment. You can't do that. You're not allowed to do that without the seller giving you written approval, which means if I want to change my deposit, I have to do an amendment of existing agreement terms and write up buyer and seller agree, buyer to reduce down payment to 10%, changing to this type of loan, whatever the details are of it, and have them sign it. And if they do that, then you're good to go. You can move on. Your loan contingency still protects you, all that stuff. But if you don't do that, if you change it without their approval, they don't have to honor it. So escrow's right to give you a hard time for reducing your down payment. Absolutely. Jenny, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
I have a question on page 1. If a buyer is choosing to purchase the property using their LLC, what kind of documentation should they be prepared to submit? The
Okay,
articles?
well that's not going to be on page 1, but yes, they'd have to have their articles of incorporation or their partnership agreement, something showing that the person that's signing on behalf of that corporation is allowed to sign on behalf of that corporation. And we'll get to that in the signature section. That's not anything that's addressed here on this page, other than the name up here would just be, for the name of the buyer would be the name of the corporation, and that's it.
Okay, thank you.
But yes, they would eventually within 5 days of acceptance, they'd have to produce proof of that corporation and their ability to sign on behalf of it. Okay. In the chat, Kyle, can a listing agent take as long as they want to respond to offers? It's been 2 weeks and no response. No, they can't, but it depends on what you mean by response. If you mean, can they wait as long as they want to send me a counter or a rejection? Maybe. Can they wait as long as they want to communicate with me in any way? Those are two different things. So if I submit an offer to a listing agent today and I call the listing agent and say, hey, I submitted my offer and he doesn't respond. I text him, he doesn't respond. I call again, he doesn't respond. I email, he doesn't respond. If there's no response for 24 hours, then I can go directly to the seller with a copy of the offer. I can give the offer to the seller and say, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, here is an offer that I submitted to your agent on this date. He hasn't replied to me. I've had no communication. There's the offer. Please let your agent know that I delivered it to you, and then walk away. You can't negotiate with him. You can't tell him any terms of that offer. All you can do is hand it to him and leave. That's allowed. But if the agent is responding to you, if the agent says, hey, look, we haven't presented yet, and they continue to talk to you, then yeah, they can string you out as long as they want, as long as you guys address that expiration. If you don't want to be strung out, you can just walk away from them because your offer is expired anyway. So I hope that answers your question. I'm not sure. Okay, I guess it did. All right. So let's move on. Go ahead.
Quick question. Oh, so how many days do we have to give them before we can present the offer to the seller directly? 2 days, 3 days?
If we have no communication for 24 hours.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Okay, here we are. Page 2. Okay, so in the chat, Lucely asked about, that was who asked about it. She says, yeah, there's been no communication. Yeah, you could go directly to the seller if you have access to them, hand them the offer and say, hey, I submitted this offer on this date and I've had zero communication from your seller or from your listing agent. Just want to make sure these offers are being presented. Now, that's legal to do, but put yourself in the listing agent's shoes, even though it sounds like he's a garbage agent. Are they going to support the seller in accepting your offer or even countering it? Probably not, because you talk to the seller, they're going to be jerks about it because they're this jerky over 2 weeks anyway. But you have the right to do it. There's nothing illegal about doing that or unethical about doing that. So feel free if you choose to do that. All right, so seller credits, if any, to the buyer. Here's the amount of the credits that we're putting in. And it says seller's credit to be applied to closing costs, or you could check off another one. Like if they're buying down a rate or doing something for you, you can leave it as closing costs, or you can put in there as a rate buy down or 2-1 buy down or whatever it is. Any of those programs, you put that in there. Again, the percentage that shows up when you put the amount in is just there for calculation. It's not a term of the contract, which means it's not going to adjust percentages based on the sales price changing. Okay, that credit is going to remain that credit. So check off the box, put the credit amount. If it's for closing costs, you can leave it as default and move on. Now, something to remember for closing cost credit, there are limits to the amount of credit that a lender will allow the buyer to get, right? Will allow them to receive. So I could ask my seller for a $20,000 closing cost credit, and he may agree, right? If I'm the buyer submitting the offer, I submit the offer to the seller says, yeah, sure, I'll give him the $20,000 credit. But the lender only allows for $15,000. That $5,000 is going back to the seller, period. End of story. There's nothing you can do to change that. Now, if the lender will allow you to use that additional $5,000 to buy down rate or pay for something else that it adds to the closing costs, great. But it's all going to be subject to what the lender allows, and there's a cap on those credits always is. The problem is that we don't have that conversation with our buyers, so our buyers think they're getting this credit regardless, and they're not going to. Some of it's going to get returned to the seller, so they need to understand that. Second thing about credits is if your lender or you as agent have agreed to give any credit to the buyer, those credits will be taken out first. So for example, that $15,000 limit on the last deal that the lender said they had, and we asked for a $20,000 credit from the seller, right? Again, but we're also already getting a $2,000 credit from the lender and a $2,000 credit from the buyer's agent, right? So there's $4,000. We're asking for the 20. I know these are crazy numbers. I'm just using them for the math. So that means that now the amount of credit that the seller can pay the buyer is only $11,000. So I've got $2,000 from the lender, $2,000 from the agent. We ask for $20,000 from the seller, but the lender will only allow up to a maximum of $15,000. So they take the lenders and the buyer's agent's credits first, and then whatever's maximum allowable, they'll take from the seller, which means the seller may have agreed to 20, but they're only going to pay 11. And your buyer's going to see that $8,000 difference or $9,000 difference in the amount of credit that they receive. And they're not going to be happy about it. They're going to be like, wait, that's money I didn't get. It's money that wasn't theirs. But we don't have the conversation with those buyer's agents about how the credits work and what's allowable and not, and what happens when there's a disallowed credit. So you have to be careful with that. And the reason that I really bring that up is because a lot of you guys asking for credits are writing your offer over asking price, putting in the credit. I mean, I know everybody's writing offers over asking price still just to get their offer accepted, but the people who are writing them over just to get the credit amount, that's where your issue comes up. Because think about it. If I'm writing the offer, if I could have got the offer accepted at 500, but I wrote it at 520 to get that $20,000 credit, because that's the conversations that we have with the listing agents, and that's the conversations we tell the buyer, like, hey, we got to write it at 520 so we can get this credit. Well, now the property appraises for 520, but the lender only allows a $10,000 credit. So now I'm paying $10,000 over. I'm not getting the money back that I was paying. So the problem with that is that the buyer is now paying a purchase price based on the promise of a return of a certain credit to cover things, even though they don't need the money for the credit, they expect it. And so you're going to have a problem with your buyer. So you guys have to be really clear on how credits work so that you don't have problems with your buyers later. I think I've shared this story with you before. At the company I worked at previously, an agent did just that, wrote an offer, $10,000 over, asking for a credit, or I don't remember what the amount was, asking for the credit, the whole thing. A big portion of that credit got denied by the lender, and the buyer's agent never asked the seller for a reduction in the purchase price to match the credit that was allowed. Because of that, they allowed it to close. That buyer called the broker of the company that I worked for and said, hey, I think what your agent did was wrong. They wrote an offer. They told me we're writing an offer at this price because we need to use the money to get a credit. I didn't get the credit, but I still paid full price. The broker agreed with the buyer and held the agent's commission. The agent sued the broker to get their commission paid, and the agent lost because the judge said the broker has the right to do what they could do to protect themselves because you put them in jeopardy by not acting in the best interest of your buyer. Now, if I'm the buyer's agent, and I've done that, I've written this offer over asking price to get a credit returned back, and that credit gets disallowed, and I can say it was a $20,000 credit, now I know I can only get a $10,000 credit. I'm going to request a reduction in sales price from the listing agent and the seller. I'm going to say, hey, listen, you're now only crediting me $10,000 instead of 20, so I'd like to reduce the sales price by $10,000. The seller doesn't have to agree, but at least my buyer can't come to me and say, you didn't do everything you could for me, because I did. I requested it. The seller denied it, and there's nothing I can do to change that. Okay, so just don't be so willy-nilly about credit and asking for closing cost credits, and then with the intention that I'm going to ask for credits for repairs instead of the actual repairs. You got to start doing calculations early, because those credits are all going to be the same credit. And so if something gets disallowed and I have a credit for repairs, my buyer's going to be upset because they're not going to have those money for the repairs. Kenya, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, so I have a question. Well, something happened to me and I just want to know why. So I understand whatever you're saying about the credit. In this situation, the bank didn't want to give me the full credit for the buyer, but I fixed that. So they made a mistake. They put it as a repairs instead of closing. So they fixed that and they ended up giving the whole credit to the buyer. But you know, at the end, when everything is recorded, it's record. So everything was pretty much done. And then the buyer was gonna get a check for 1,100, and they were not able because the bank said the buyer couldn't get more than 500 back at the end. So the bank ended up changing it and deducting those $600 from the closing cost, because the
Credit.
bank. So
Yeah.
how that happened? Like, can the bank?
Because the bank is not in the habit of giving you cash because you bought a house. They're not gonna give you money back. I'm surprised they gave them the 500. If there's credits being paid by the seller back and they exceed the amount of credits that they need to pay, they can't keep it. It has to go back to the seller. So I'm surprised that the bank even let them keep the 500.
But like at the end, like every buyer gets some type of extra money once the transaction is closed.
The
Like
only reason they get extra money is if they put more money than they needed to in for the deposit. If it's based on a credit, they're not going to get it.
But it was not on
They're not going to get
based on the whole transaction at the end. You know, when the buyer gets the check.
No, I know what you're saying. But how much of a credit did you get back from the seller?
5,000. Like how much
So
did
they didn't need 5,000 obviously to close, because they got $1,100 back.
okay.
Their closing costs got reduced. Something happened. They didn't need $1,100 of the money that they had to put in to escrow. So the bank can't give you money from the seller. You can't get cash back. So they said, we'll let you have 500 and that's it. The other 600, it went back to the seller. It didn't go to the bank, it didn't go to anybody else. It went back to the seller. That you can't get money. They're not going to allow you to get credits or money back more than what you're paying for the house.
Okay. But he paid more, like he gave like 1,500 total. Yeah, 15,000, I'm sorry. Total, like he deposited, like total.
Okay. What was his down payment? 15,000?
8,000 down payment, I think. So it was like a lower price.
Okay, so then why did he put $15,000 in if his down payment was 8,000?
So it was like the down payment and the closing costs altogether, like 15.
And how much was the closing cost then? Because you got a $5,000 credit from the buyer, from the seller. So how much were his closing costs?
I checked and it was about, I don't remember. I have to go back and check the numbers.
Just know that if your credits exceed what you're paying closing costs, you're not going to get the credit. They're going to give the money back. And they probably let him have 500 because that 500 would have constituted his $500 over of the money he put in. So you have to look at your closing statement. Just know that you're not going to get money back from a closing unless it's your money that you put too much in. That's it. If there's any credits that exceed the money that you need to put in, you're not getting. Period. End of story.
Okay.
Okay. So you have to look at your closing statement. Yeah, Lulu, go ahead.
I had a situation where escrow did a principal reduction.
In
For
order
the
to
money.
what, as opposed to a credit
As
for
opposed to
repairs?
going back to the seller. They did a principal reduction by the amount that the lender wouldn't allow for the buyer to get as a credit.
But that still has to go through the lender. It's not escrow doesn't get to make those choices. The lender's the one that decides. So the lender probably said, we'll allow those credits to go through if it's a principal reduction.
Yeah.
The lender still has to approve that credit. It's not like escrow isn't magical. They don't get to dictate how it works. Like the lender still has to see it and approve and say, okay, well, you're paying down. It's the same thing as like if I took a closing cost credit and paid down my rate, you're just paying extra on the principal when
Right.
at the time. So yeah, but the lender still has to approve that. The lender could say, oh no, we don't want that. This is what it is and this is how it works. So, you know, you have to keep in mind that you can't just assume that you're going to get all the money. The lender is the one that's going to dictate whether or not you get it or you don't get it. And that's the only thing I'm trying to get across here for you guys is you have to talk to your buyers about it, because the conversations I have with agents is like, oh, we'll just ask for a credit. We'll ask for a credit. But wait a minute, right? Credits aren't the answers to all your issues. Especially because if that's what you do to solve a problem and then a lender says nope at the end, you're screwed. And so that's why the conversations with credit and you guys as buyers agents and listing agents understanding how credits work, you have to do that because you don't want to put yourself in a position where a deal's starting to fall apart because a buyer's pissed off about the amount of money that they're not getting any longer. So you just have to be careful. That's all that you have to just have that conversation with credit. So there's all kinds of things that you could do. I mean, we could, you know, lenders could talk for hours on how we could restructure and do things. That's fine. But in this case, as a contract, what we're talking about is your buyer has to be crystal clear on that not all credits approved or not all credits given are going to be approved by the lender. And that's it. That's where you have to approach it. Okay. All right. Additional financing terms. This is not where we ask for the closing cost credit, obviously, because that goes right here. The only thing really you're going to put on here is if your buyer is qualifying for some kind of special financing, right? Like a down payment assistance. And if you know the name of the program, write it in. They're getting a grant, something like that, you're going to put here. Also, if we go back, and I kind of skipped over this, I'm not sure I skipped over this or not, it was last week, but this all cash thing. Sometimes buyers who are purchasing with a hard money loan, they check off the all cash, even though it's not. If you did check off all cash and maybe there's your buyer's making a decision on, do I want to spend my money or do I want to get a loan? Then check off the all cash. And then right here, you would write, you know, buyer has the option of obtaining private money financing or hard money financing, those kind of things. Okay. Excuse me. If hard money is going to be an option, I would probably not check off the all cash just because hard money loans still have conditions. And so we want to make sure that there is some kind of loan contingency still protecting them if they can't qualify. Okay. But that's really the only thing that's going to go here in additional financing terms. I get a lot of questions about paragraph 3G3. The seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. It's a lot of confusion for agents out there. If you are submitting an offer on a property that you saw in the MLS that is being paid compensation by the listing broker, you don't need to check this box. The only reason you check that box is if I have a buyer's broker's representation and compensation agreement, right, with my client. So I have a buyer and my buyer signed that buyer representation and compensation agreement. And it says that buyer is going to pay me 3% commission. And that buyer says now, instead of me paying it, I would like the seller to pay it on top of any other commissions. That's what that box is for. That box is there for me as buyer requesting that the seller pay the commission that I promised to pay my buyer's agent. So unless that's you as a buyer's agent, do not check that box ever. Because the problem with that is now it just made my offer weaker because whatever I'm offering now, as a listing agent, I have to assume that means I'm paying a commission if I accept that offer. So I got to either counter it or I'm going to ignore it altogether. Okay, so don't check that box unless you have a buyer representation and compensation agreement and your buyer is asking the seller to pay his obligation of compensating you. It has nothing to do with the compensation in the MLS from the listing agent. This is completely separate. Question. Anybody have any questions? All right, good. I'm assuming that you all understand that now. Verification of all cash, default is now it's attached, right? It used to be the default was within 3 days. Now it's default is attached. You shouldn't be submitting an all cash offer without your proof of funds being attached anyway, okay? As a listing agent though, just because they send you verification of funds doesn't necessarily mean you have to accept those as verification of funds, right? So, for example, verification of funds could be a gift letter and a bank account from, you know, an uncle, or it could be the 401k, or it could be some kind of a market account, something that they're not liquid funds. So you have to take into consideration that those funds maybe are going to be a little bit harder to get. Something you could do is if it's like a gift funds or something, because gifted funds sometimes have a history of that gift disappearing, right? They get a gift from the father or the father-in-law or the uncle or whatever, and they have a disagreement, and all of a sudden that gift has disappeared. You know, as a listing agent, to protect your seller, you could do things like, okay, all gifted funds need to be deposited in escrow within X amount of time after acceptance, right? So that they're there. They may not be part of liquidated damages. They may not have a chance. They may not lose them, but at least you know they're there, so that later that, you know, uncle, father, brother, whatever doesn't say, no, I don't like them anymore and I don't want to give them the money. So just keep things in mind. Like, it's not just like a blanket, yeah, it's accepted. You can address those things in counters if you feel a little uncomfortable with what the verification of the all cash offer is, or the verification of the down payment money. Okay, same thing, because that verification of down payment money is the same thing. It has to be attached to the offer. Okay. The verification of loan application, we all know what that is. It's either the pre-qual, the pre-approval, the underwriter, the DU, whatever it is you've got from the lender that shows that you qualify, that you've gone through the process of applying for this mortgage. That's what that is. Should be attached. Pretty straightforward. Okay. All right. So let's see, 1154. Oh, let's do this. Final verification of condition. Okay. Paragraph 3J. And then it says paragraph 16 here. That's where it's going to just, you know, have more description of what happens for the final verification of condition. That's the final walkthrough. That's 5 days prior to close of escrow. So the reason that the final verification is important is because it's the buyer going in and saying, yes, this is the condition that I've agreed upon the property. Let's go ahead and close. Now that final verification is not a contingency, which means just because there's an issue, it does not give the buyer carte blanche to cancel and walk away from the transaction if there's an issue. That's why it's done 5 days prior, because it still gives us an opportunity to address any issues that may exist based on that walkthrough. So if I go and do a walkthrough, right, and I do it when I'm supposed to, 5 days prior to close, and it was because I had, you know, the buyer had requested some repairs, and we also want to make sure that the condition of the property is still the same as it was when we wrote the offer. If there's an issue, if something got damaged that wasn't damaged when we wrote the offer, if a repair wasn't completed, then what we do is we send a request to the listing agent to extend the escrow. I don't sign my loan docs, and we negotiate getting that thing fixed and how long it'll take in order for us to fix it. Or the seller says, you know what, we'll leave X money behind, paid payable to this contractor. He's the one who's going to take care of it. We'll take care of it after. And if the buyer agrees, and we move on. Okay. But that's why it's important that it's 5 days prior, because 5 days prior is generally you haven't signed loan documents yet, right? Once you sign loan docs as a buyer, it's really downhill, right? It's the deal is gonna close at that point, right? I sign loan docs, it funds the next day, usually records the day after that, and then we're closed, right? So that's 3 days. I need to make sure that when my microphone got disconnected because I'm moving my.
Okay, there we go. Anyway, so what happens is if I sign loan docs in 3 days, we're going to close, right? Usually max. So what I do is if the lender calls and says, yeah, we can order docs, great. I'm going to call and schedule my final walkthrough. I'll let you know before we order the docs. Call, schedule my final walkthrough, do the final walkthrough. Everything's cool. Call the lender, order docs. We sign docs, we close. If there's a problem, then I don't order the docs because I don't want to have a time period where I run out of time because docs expire. And I don't want to do my final walkthrough after I've signed docs because again, now it's going to fund quickly. And I got to hold funding and you can only hold funding for so long. And now what happens is there's a bunch of pressure on us that we have to close and we get in a position where we have to accept the property in a condition that we're not happy with because we did it so late. The other issue that I get to see a lot is, oh, well, the seller's living in the property, for 10 days after. So we're going to do our final walkthrough after. Well, that's not what the final walkthrough is. The final walkthrough is to is to verify the condition of the property prior to you closing. If you close and you do a final and you go and check out the property, that's not a final walkthrough. It doesn't work. So in order to do that, you've got to do a waiver of your final walkthrough, which means you take on some responsibility as a buyer saying, yeah, we're just taking it in as is condition. No, if the seller is living in the property, you do your final walkthrough, even if they're living there, because I want to make sure they did the repairs. The repairs are supposed to be done before close, not after close. So I want to see if they're done. I want to see if they've caused any kind of damage to the property. And if they're moving out in 10 days, they've already started packing. So I'll get to see anything. So guys, do your walkthrough 5 days prior. Do not put it off. You can't do it after. It doesn't work like that. You're putting yourself in a position where you're opening yourself up to some kind of litigation because you're not doing what's best for your client. And that's what you have to explain to your client is, hey, listen, I know they're still living there, but you got to find out what the condition is before we close, not after. So if we look at it before we close, we're like, okay, the condition's good. And then we go because they moved out because they were staying in the property and now it's not in that condition. Well, then we have different steps that we take to get compensated, right, for the damages that they created prior to us taking possession of the property. So final walkthrough 5 days prior, not less and not more because it doesn't make sense, but never less than the 5 days prior so that you have some time to work around any issues that may come up. Okay. But it is not a contingency, which means that if there is a problem, you can't just cancel and say, well, we're canceling because our final walkthrough of the property was in poor condition. It doesn't work like that. You could still lose your deposit as a buyer's agent. Okay. Questions? Any questions?
Hi,
Yes, Jenny.
I have a question, but it's more on responses of counteroffers. Do I wait till we get to that
No, it's fine.
presentation?
No, go ahead. It's fine. What's going on?
Okay, what do you recommend when we have multiple offers? We're the listing agents. We have multiple offers that have come in, say beyond 10, and they all have different terms. What's the best way to respond to them without having to like individually do each one? Or is it individually we have to do each one? Because that takes a long time. Is there
I mean, you have to do them individually because they all have different terms probably that you have to address. If the problem with a blanket counter that you would send to everybody is that it doesn't address all the terms. So yeah, you're going to have to do them separately probably.
Okay, just checking because when I was at the sellers and we were just like writing one after the other, I said, is there like a step I'm missing? Are we doing something like, could there be a better way?
No, but I don't see that there's a necessity to counter 10 offers. I mean, my opinion and my advice is when you're a listing agent is you get 10 offers or 15 offers, you find the 3 or 4 best and you counter those and the rest you reject. If you're countering 10 or 15, that's a problem.
Unless the sellers instruct us though. But yeah, that was our recommendation.
But that's also a direction to the seller. Like, listen, we're not going to counter off 15 because it doesn't make sense. These 3 are clear in a way, or these 4 are clear in a way the best. Let's counter those. If you want to later on after the fact, maybe include somebody as a backup offer. But I mean, if the seller instructs you, you got to do it. But I mean, it also has to be us as listing agents. We have to have some guidance over our clients.
Right. No, and that's what we did. But these are particular sellers. And I was just wondering, like, is there a better way for us to do this?
Not unless you're just gonna do a blanket counter, but then you're gonna have terms of a counter that don't apply to some of the offers that you're submitting. So
okay, just double checking.
Yeah. And I
I
see
had a
that all
question
the
to add to
time.
that.
I do see all the time where people come to me and they're like, I got this counter, it doesn't make any sense. And it's just a blanket counter. It's probably the same counter they send to everybody, you know, a boilerplate thing that they have created. And some of the terms don't apply to the offer that are, and it confuses the agent. So again, you want to be as clear and as professional as possible. Don't confuse the buyer and the buyer's agent, because this is going to make smoke come out of their ears. And, you know, I don't know, maybe do it. Maybe that'll be one less buyer's agent out there. Go ahead, Joseph.
It's just to add on to that. So couldn't you just do a multiple counter with the terms that the seller wants, and so that it gives the buyers, all 10 buyers, the option to either to switch their offer to those terms or not?
Yes, but not everybody's going to be the same. Not everybody's going to be the same.
Yeah, no, I'm just
Like,
saying just to
hold
do,
on,
you know,
Joseph.
okay.
Joseph, listen. You ask your question. Listen, slow down. Yeah, the problem is there are going to be other. You could, if it's all you're worried about is price, then yeah, go for it. Just put sales price to B and send everybody the same one. The problem is that if it's FHA, it means we have to do a new FHA mandatory clause. If it's, you know, VA, does it? What's the down payment to? What if I have to change deposit? What if somebody's deposit is only $1,000? Am I going to accept their offer with $1,000 deposit just because they went up to the higher price? Like, there's still stuff like. That's what I'm saying is, in order for us to be professional, you have to do it. That's why, I mean, I don't mean for you, Jenny and Danny, that this is crazy, but it's crazy that the seller wants to counter 10 or 15 offers. Ridiculous.
It wasn't that, Kyle. It's just that they were literally like 5,000 apart from each other, and it was all in this little bulk price point, and they're looking at that price point. So I get what you're saying, though. Thank you.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's you, but even if they're all within 5,000, I guarantee you there are 3 or 4 that are better than the other 10. Even if they're the same price, I guarantee there's better credit, better money in the bank. You know, they're better. There's things that's the other thing is we have to start understanding too, as buyers and listing agents, it's not always price that makes things the best. We have to look for other terms. And I think that for the majority of you guys that are on here as listing agents, you do that. You look at what all of the terms are. I think the majority of the agents out there that are uneducated and just do the job as order takers, because that's the market we came out of, they're looking at just the first page of the price and the down payment, and that's it. They're not weighing other things in. Okay, Darwin, and that's it.
Okay, boss. When you were saying regarding the walkthrough, you do it like 3-5 days before closing.
5 days, not 3 days, 5 days.
Oh, 5 days. Let's say that I go and I see a lot of trash. I see some holes that was not there in the wall, drywall, whatever. What would you do in that case?
You set an extension of time for closing to the listing agent. You set a list of all the damages that you saw and whatever the issues were in the final walkthrough. You write it down, holes in the wall, trash on the property. You send that to the listing agent and you say, we want this stuff repaired before we closed, and this is the time we think you're going to need to do it. Here's the extension of time addendum for close of escrow. Now, if they don't accept it, they say, no, we're not going to. You guys either close or, you know, we're going to keep your deposit. Then you go back to your buyer and say, this is what's happening. They're not going to agree to fix the stuff. We don't have a contingency to walk away because they didn't do what they were supposed to. What would happen is we'd be forced to close, and then you would have to go to small claims and look for damages for them from whatever work you have to do to get the property into livable condition. You tell me what you want to do. Do you want to jeopardize your deposit, or do you want to close as it is? That's it. That's what you can do. That's all you can do. That's it. All right, guys. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. I will see you guys next Thursday, and we will continue from where we left off. Take care. Have a good one.